Hi folks, my name is Phil and welcome to Grounded, the series which looks at airlines of yesteryear. This episode will take a look at Brymon Airways. Brymon Aviation Limited was founded on the 26th of January 1970 by journalist Bill Bryce and Formula One racing driver Chris Amon, with the airline being the portmanteau of their names, Bryce and Amon. Bryce would take on the roles of director and chairman as well as be the majority shareholder, whilst Amon returned to motor racing. The first aircraft was delivered in early 1970, a Britten Norman Islander which was deployed on various ad hoc passenger and cargo flights from Plymouth and Newquay. During their formative years, the company, like a number of others that went on to become regional carriers, was a bit of a mixed bag of an operation. In early 1972, Brymon acquired the Fair Oaks Flying Service, a flight school located at Fair Oaks Airport in Surrey, which had a single Cessna 182. A second Cessna would soon arrive, however, this was the largest Cessna 337 Skymaster and would operate out of Plymouth alongside the company's Islander. 1972 would also see the company operate its first scheduled passenger services, with Brymon Aviation rebranding as Brymon Airways to reflect this. A second Islander joined the fleet and services began from Newquay and Plymouth to the Scilly Isles, with several flights a day between the two during the summer and a reduced service over the winter. These flights were certainly an experience for passengers, as it was a single pilot operation, meaning that on rare occasions it was possible to grab the right-hand seat up front. With the flight usually cruising at a mere 2,000 feet and the captain doubling up as a tour guide, pointing out landmarks along the way, it was more like a pleasure flight than an air service. In fact, Brymon would later offer flights between Plymouth and Newquay for just £11 return. These were aimed at tourists who may never have had the opportunity to fly before. Flights would also begin from Plymouth to the Channel Islands, with both Jersey and Guernsey seeing service by the end of the year. These flights were, of course, much more conventional. 1973 would see the Plymouth to Scilly Isles flights extended to serve Exeter, and the end of the year would see Brymon go international when flights from Plymouth to Morlaix began in November. This route to northwest France would initially be served 4 times a week, however, early the following year it was upgraded to twice per day. In April 1974, Brymon took delivery of their first de Havilland DHC-6 Twin Otter, becoming the first British airline to operate the type. Another Islander would arrive in December 1974, but would soon leave for Singapore, as Brymon was now also dipping their hand in aircraft sales and maintenance. Oddly enough, this particular Islander had previously been owned by Fair Oaks Flying Service, who then sold it to Peter Cadbury, heir to the chocolate millions, around the time that Brymon took over. Incidentally, Peter Cadbury owned Westward Television, the local ITV franchise for the southwest of England, and towards the end of the decade he would form Air Westward, which would be acquired by British Island Airways in March 1979 and rebranded as Air West for the remainder of the year. It would then be amalgamated into the newly forming Air UK the following year. Sometimes it's quite amazing how so many airlines are connected in one way or the other. During the year, a new route would open up between Plymouth and Cardiff, and the following year flights would begin to Alderney and the Channel Islands, as well as the introduction of more international routes. Cherbourg in France was added, along with a seasonal flight from Plymouth to Cork, marking Brymon's entry into the Emerald Isle. This expansion was in part due to an additional Britten Norman Islander being leased from Intra Airways, who were, in a roundabout way, the forerunner to Jersey European and later Flybe. Again, everything's connected. In January 1977, a Handley Page Darts Herald was acquired second-hand. This one had been built in 1965 and delivered to Sadia Transportes Aéreos, later known as Trans-Brazil. While the Dart Herald had both a larger passenger capacity and higher cruising speed than both of the Islanders and Twin Otters being used by the airline, Brymon wouldn't acquire any more of the type. 1977 would also see Brymon awarded the route licence to operate between Newquay and London Heathrow, with the airline picking it up from British Midland. This route would see a twice-a-day service during the week and once on Saturdays. London Gatwick would join the route network the following year with a twice-daily flight from Plymouth beginning in 1978. These flights would connect Plymouth with Brymon's flights to Cherbourg and Morlaix, and according to a Brymon newsletter, that due to the steep fare rises on French domestic flights, it was actually cheaper to fly from London to Brittany with Brymon than fly direct from London. 1979 saw considerable expansion for Brymon. Southampton and Birmingham saw the introduction of flights from Plymouth, and France saw a third destination, with Brest seeing a daily service from Plymouth. Aberdeen would see a twice-a-week flight from Newquay, with flights taking place on Mondays and Fridays, and would be the beginning of a relationship between Brymon and the North Sea oil and gas industry. Brymon was really utilising its small fleet well. A number of routes were operated as through flights, so for example it was possible to fly from Cherbourg to Birmingham with a quick stop in Plymouth. GBDHC, which had been delivered in 1974, was the first Twin Otter on the British Aircraft Register. It had been given a fitting registration for the occasion, Great British de Havilland, Canada. After nearly 5 years with Brymon, it was sold to the Chubb Group, who would use the aircraft to support the famous Trans-Globe expedition. Ranulph Fiennes, Charles Burton and Oliver Shepherd would leave London on the 2nd of September 1979 and circumnavigate the globe via both the North and South Poles. Their journey would use a variety of surface transportation and be completed on August 29, 1982, just days shy of 3 years after beginning. The Twin Otter would be there in a support capacity should anything go wrong, and needed to be specially modified with skids to allow landing on snow and ice. The Brymon livery was replaced with a red, white and blue scheme, with the tops of the wings painted black in order to absorb sunlight and help reduce icing. Prince Charles is seen here after ferrying the aircraft from RAF Odiham to Farnborough and accepting delivery of the aircraft from Brymon. 1979 would also see Brymon become the first British airline to order the de Havilland Dash-7, a 50-seat, 4-engine turboprop with STOL, that's short takeoff and landing capabilities. The first deliveries were scheduled for 1981 and Brymon had already made plans for them. The 1980s got off to a flying start, pardon the pun, with Brymon adding more destinations including Manchester, served from Newquay, Birmingham and East Midlands Airport, with both being served from Plymouth. Some of the flights to both Birmingham and East Midlands Airport would operate through Gatwick, as Brymon really began to weave a strong route network across the south of the country. The first 3 of Brymon's new de Havilland Dash-7s arrived in the summer of 1981, with 2 more following in the autumn. Their arrival allowed the withdrawal of their last remaining Briton-Norman Islander, as well as the sole Handley Page Dart Herald, which departed for Janus Airways that December. As Brymon were now operating the rugged and STOL-capable Dash-7s, they were an easy choice to be awarded a contract by Chevron Oil to operate support flights between Aberdeen and Unst, a small airstrip located in the Shetland Islands and Britain's most northerly airport. It was rather fitting, as Brymon was now serving both Britain's most northerly airport at Unst and the most southerly in Jersey. These flights to Unst would transport workers and support personnel who would then connect with helicopters flying to offshore oil and gas rigs. 1981 would also see a subsidiary company of Brymon, Brymon Airports, obtain the lease for Plymouth City Airport. This lease, initially awarded for 125 years, would give Brymon Airports control over both the day-to-day running of the airport and its future development, which would go hand in hand with Brymon Airways' own growth. In 1982, Brymon, along with Liverpool's Genair, joined the newly created British Caledonian commuter network. British Caledonian, or BCAL for short, were headquartered near Gatwick and was the second of the country's flag carriers, who sadly always played second fiddle to British Airways, but the BCAL story's for another day, however. Brymon were at a slight advantage over Genair in that their livery was already very similar to BCAL, right down to the blue over yellow cheat lines. That said, Brymon didn't apply BCAL branding to any of their aircraft, unlike Genair, who not only began to apply the Caledonian livery to their fleet, but also arranged for their soon-to-be-delivered Short 360 to be sporting the new scheme on delivery. The London Docklands, which, like its much larger inland dockland up here in Salford, had, by the end of the 1970s, become run down and derelict following the end of their shipping industries. The London Docklands Development Corporation was established by the British government in 1981 to look at ways of regenerating the area. Canary Wharf was planned and the idea of a new airport was first mooted. It would be quite a task, however, as space was limited, but new aircraft such as the Dash-7 and British Aerospace BAE 146 with STOL capabilities offered some hope for the project. Sunday the 27th of June 1982 would see a Brymon Airways de Havilland Dash-7 turboprop, flown by the airline's chief captain Harry Gee, land on a makeshift runway at Heron Quay at the Docklands site. Brymon had been instrumental in the idea of the new airport, and while Heron Key itself wouldn't form part of the airport, it proved that short takeoff and landing, or STOL aircraft, could operate from the proposed airport. The act was repeated the following year as part of a public inquiry into the project, and shortly afterwards, London City Airport was given the green light for construction. By 1983, Brymon was in serious financial trouble. The airline's expansion, combined with the cost of introducing a brand new aircraft type to the British Register, had caught up with it. Their new Dash-7s had been financed in dollars, and the early 80s recession saw the value of the pound plummet, making it practically impossible for the company to make the repayments. The company had debts of around $2.8 million, which is just shy of $9.7 million adjusted for inflation. While this seems like a relatively small amount today, back then other airlines had been wound up for less. Rescue came in the unlikely shape of de Havilland Canada, who stepped in and acquired a 75% stake in the company in an effort to prevent Brymon's collapse. It was certainly unusual, but not unheard of for an aircraft manufacturer to step in like this. However, de Havilland weren't just thinking about Brymon, but others that could be affected by their demise, particularly oil companies which relied on de Havilland aircraft to support their global exploration operations, and also, crucially, relied on Brymon to transport their workers to the Shetland Islands. As part of the restructure, founder Bill Bryce left the company, and Charles Stewart, a former marketing chief and board member at British Airways, would take on the role of chief executive at Brymon. 1983 would end with the Brymon fleet standing at 6 aircraft, split right down the middle with 3 Twin Otters and 3 Dash-7s. 1983 would also see the end of Brymon's French services, as the airline tried to get the most out of its fleet and focus on the most profitable routes. In 1985, Brymon Airways would feature in the British travel programme Wish You Were Here, in which host Judith Chalmers travels from London Heathrow to Plymouth, and co-host Chris Kelly flies from Plymouth to the Isles of Scilly. The show gave a brief glimpse inside the inner workings of Brymon at the time, even a peek inside their operations room at Plymouth before Chris Kelly's flight to St Mary's. The programme certainly bigged up Brymon. How flying with them had a club-like feel to it, as well as promoting little-known services, such as how one could buy a London tube ticket on board, or even arrange a taxi to meet them at Plymouth Airport. The programme also pointed out that a flight from London to Plymouth was just 1 hour, and not only 3 times quicker than the train, but also cost the same as a first-class train ticket. Speaking of trains, Brymon teamed up with British Rail to offer the Rail Air Link, in which it was possible to book travel between Cork and anywhere on the British Rail network, with a flight between Cork and Plymouth and then onward by train. It was mainly to promote travel from the south and south-east, particularly Bristol, Oxford, Slough, Reading, Oxford and London, but BR did include fare zones right up to just over the Scottish border for anyone who fancied a very long train journey. Actually, it was 1985, so train travel was rather fun, with a nice big diesel or electric locomotive up front and windows one could flail from, and not that awful rubbish on rails that we have now. Hold on, I'm getting distracted here. In January 1986, Brymon underwent a management buyout. Led by Chief Executive Charles Stewart, several Brymon executives, along with British Airways and Maersk of Denmark, formed a holding company called the Plimsoll Line, which then acquired Brymon Holdings from de Havilland Canada. While the actual cost of the deal was never revealed, part of the sale agreement was that Brymon would pay DHC 15% of the airline's net profits for 5 years. This figure would decrease by £125,000 for each new aircraft bought from them, however. A very shrewd bit of business there from the guys over in Canada. Brymon would refresh their livery during 1987. The blue and yellow cheat lines were retired in favour of a predominantly white fuselage, with a yellow, grey and blue stripe running down the tail and around the rear of the fuselage. The same stripes would also be adopted as a company logo, applied to the aircraft engines and literature such as timetables, posters and baggage tags. I would be remiss in my duties as a train-obsessed muppet if I didn't point out some similarity between those and the Network South East Flashes logo. On the 31st of May 1987, a Brymon de Havilland Dash-7, which had been specially named City of London, made the first ever landing at London City Airport, just 6 years after the demonstration landing at the nearby Heron Key. Brymon would open an office at the new airport ahead of its official opening in the autumn. Brymon also signed a deal with Air France to operate flights from the new airport to Paris, and to commemorate the occasion renamed one of their aircraft, GBRYA, Ville de Paris. On Monday the 26th of October 1987, the first commercial flights took place at London City Airport. The honours were split between Brymon and Eurocity Express. The first arrival into the new airport was a Brymon Dash-7 coming in from Plymouth. The first departure was a Eurocity Express Dash-7 departing for Paris. Eurocity Express were owned by British Midland and would very quickly rebrand as London City Airways. I covered them way back in episode 25, so go and check that out if you want to know more. Brymon's new London to Paris route hit a brick wall pretty quickly when on the 18th of December 1987 the Civil Aviation Authority suspended the route. The CAA were concerned over potential traffic conflicts in the increasingly busy skies over Kent. Something which you'd think the CAA would have thought about earlier, but there you go. The route would be reinstated just over a month later on January 20th. In late 1988, Brymon's parent company, the Plimsoll Line, acquired Birmingham Executive Airways for around £1.92 million, and a few months later would rebrand it as Birmingham European Airways. For the time being, the Plimsoll Line were happy to keep both Birmingham European and Brymon separate. The following year, Brymon would be joint runners-up alongside British Airways in the UK Domestic Airlines category in the Executive Travel Awards. 1990 would see Brymon receive an even bigger accolade, winning Air Transport World's Commuter Airline of the Year award. According to one source, some Brymon higher-ups arranged to catch their 7 a.m. flight from London City to Paris, where their partner, Air France, would provide a small press party and champagne breakfast before the folks would fly on an Air France Concorde to New York to collect the award trophy. Unfortunately for them, Paris was fogged in, and a quick dash over to Heathrow would see them make the 10 a.m. British Airways Concorde flight, with no press party however. Brymon's London City operation expanded further during 1990 with the introduction of flights to Lille, Nantes and Strasbourg at the request of partner Air France. One Brymon Dash-7 had already been wearing an Air France livery since 1989, however, with the introduction of more routes a second Dash-7 was painted up. One additional aircraft was drafted in on lease from London City Airways. It was painted in full Brymon livery and would be with the airline until early the following year. 2 new de Havilland Dash-8s were delivered in the autumn. The Dash-8 was similar to Brymon's existing Dash-7s but had 2 engines instead of 4, and these first 2 to be delivered were the smaller 100 series models which had a capacity of 37 passengers. Several of the larger 50-seat 300 series models were also ordered for future expansion. Bristol, which had seen service from Brymon as far back as 1985, was now seen as a key airport in the airline's future success. Previously, Brymon operated flights to the Scilly Isles via Newquay from here, but it was now lined up to become Brymon's main hub. The 2 brand new Dash-8s delivered at the tail end of 1990 were pressed into service, and the airline's first Dash-8 300 arrived in the spring of 1991 as the Bristol base began to take shape. New routes from Bristol included Jersey and the Channel Islands, Newcastle and Aberdeen, as Brymon quickly established itself as a dominant scheduled carrier at the airport. Brymon also held a press conference expressing interest in the British Aerospace BAE 146. The Whisperjet with STOL capability had been touted to Brymon in the early 1980s, but the airline had opted for the Dash-7 prop instead. The larger BAE 146-300, which had a capacity of 100 passengers, had entered airline service a couple of years earlier and was looking attractive for Brymon's growing ambitions. 1991 was a tough year for Brymon, however. The country was in the midst of yet another recession, and this was further compounded by the First Gulf War. A number of airlines collapsed over the year, including the legendary Pan Am over in the United States, and closer to home, Air Europe and their parent company, the International Leisure Group. Brymon made losses of around £1.5 million, but continued to look at steady growth as their way out of financial peril, rather than the often seen, cut everything until there's nothing left and then go bust approach used by many a failed airline. Unlike British Midland, who pulled the plug on their London City Airways outfit, Brymon soldiered on, operating their Air France partnership flights to Paris, Lille and Strasbourg. 1992 would see a new route open from London City, with Brymon operating a 4 times a day service to Brussels in partnership with the Belgian state airline Sabena. The Air France partnership eventually dissolved, with both the Lille and Strasbourg routes being dropped. However, the Paris route remained. The 2 Dash-7s, which had been in Air France livery, were soon painted back into Brymon livery as well. The second -8-300 was delivered in the spring as Brymon strengthened its position in Bristol. Flights were added to Belfast, Cork, Dublin, Plymouth, Glasgow and Edinburgh. Flights from Bristol to Paris were also introduced, as well as a service to Guernsey. 1991 would also see Chief Executive Charles Stewart retire on April the 1st to be succeeded by Malcolm Naylor. Unfortunately, it was a short retirement as Charles Stewart died just 2 years later. On October 1st, 1992, Brymon Airways was merged with Birmingham European Airways to form Brymon European. The new airline would use the existing Brymon livery but would feature a new logo, that of a hummingbird. The existing Brymon fleet received the new logo, and the Birmingham European fleet was painted up in the new livery, with their BAC 111 jets looking particularly smart. Brymon European will combine the existing Brymon route network with that of Birmingham European, with 3 main bases in Plymouth, Bristol and Birmingham, with Birmingham having a particularly strong international network. Prior to the merger, Birmingham European operated flights to Amsterdam, Belfast, Copenhagen, Cork, Gothenburg, Milan, Newcastle, Oslo, Stockholm and Stuttgart. Brymon, of course, had a predominantly domestic network, but had also established a strong presence as the South West's own airline. It was hoped that their combined route network would reduce both airlines' losses and make a stronger airline. The spring of 1993 would see Brymon European expand further with the addition of a further -8 as well as a former London City Airways -7 leased from British Midland. New routes included Bristol to Frankfurt and Newcastle to Paris, and on the surface things seemed to be going well for Brymon European. However, behind the scenes, this wasn't the case. The combined airline had failed to deliver any meaningful savings. Whilst both sides of the airline brought something to the party, their respective route networks didn't really overlap and offered the synergies envisioned by the Plimsoll line. Rather oddly, the head office functions were split between the former Brymon head office in Plymouth and Birmingham Europeans in Birmingham and led to some duplication, if not in personnel, certainly in building costs. This, combined with a not particularly complementary route network, suggested a lack of willingness to integrate the two airlines properly, almost like two people getting married but also keeping their own houses on the side. On the 11th of May 1993, barely half a year after merging, it was announced that Brymon European Airways would be split. The former Birmingham European operation would be acquired by AP Moller Maersk Group and rebranded as Maersk Air UK, and British Airways would acquire the former Brymon Airways side of the company as well as assume complete control of the Plimsoll line. While the two airlines had split up, they had both found themselves on a similar course. Maersk Air UK became a franchise operator of British Airways, and as a result saw their fleet painted in the iconic British Airways Landau livery. Brymon, now as a fully owned subsidiary of British Airways, would also find its fleet adorned with what I personally consider the best airline livery in history, as they joined the developing British Airways Express network, which at the time consisted of several other franchise partners. In keeping with the Landau livery tradition of each aircraft bearing a name, some of the Brymon fleet wore names of British counties. These included Somerset, Northumberland, Lanarkshire and the Shetland Islands. GBRYD wore Cornwall on the port side and Kernow on the starboard, with Kernow being Cornish for Cornwall in the old language of Kernowek. 1995 would see Brymon report a profit for the first time in several years, with the airline taking £1.53 million after tax, a huge step up from the near £4.3 million loss the year before as the ship finally began to stabilise following the failed merger, but 1996 would see big changes at Brymon. In the spring, Brymon would take delivery of 5 de Havilland Dash-8-300s. These were delivered between mid-March and the end of May. All 5 were second-hand with shared heritage, as they had all previously served with Air Wisconsin and then Atlantic Coast Airlines and Mesa before heading across the Atlantic Ocean to Britain. This wasn't a rational expansion, however, as 2 of these would replace the 2 smaller 100 series models, and the others would replace most of the older Dash-7s. The spring of 1996 would also see Brymon awarded a lucrative 3-year contract to carry oil rig personnel between Aberdeen and the Shetland Islands. This contract was from a consortium of oil companies led by BP Exploration and worth £10 million. It would see the formation of a new company, Brymon Offshore Air Charter Limited, created specially for the occasion. This new division would take 2 Dash-7s from Brymon, Yankee Alpha and Yankee Delta. The two aircraft would be painted in a special and rather attractive livery, which consisted of a white fuselage, blue belly, and stylised ocean waves climbing up towards and onto the tail, which prominently featured a puffin. In 1997, British Airways unveiled its World Tales livery as part of the incredibly poncy Project Utopia plan. Out went the iconic Landor-designed livery and branding, and in came a livery that can still cause fierce debate to this day. The Brymon aircraft would lose their Landor livery and sport a selection of World Tales schemes. The Brymon fleet would wear Benny Home, Column, Grand Union, Waves of the City, Rendezvous and Colour Down the Side. This last one, Colour Down the Side, was designed by artist Terry Frost, who was a native of Cornwall, and supposedly it depicts the landscape of Cornwall. While I do like this design, I really don't see it, but hey, that's why I'm not an art critic. The Brymon logo was also changed. The yellow, grey and blue flashes were replaced by a single red one, which was more in keeping with the British Airways designed uniforms that the Brymon crews and ground staff would now wear. Incidentally, this same logo was also introduced at Plymouth City Airport, which was still under the stewardship of the Plimsoll line. 1998 saw 8 more de Havilland Dash-8s arrive fresh from the factory in Toronto and brought the airline's fleet to 16 Dash-8s and 2 Dash-7s. One additional Dash-7 was brought in on a short-term lease to cover the offshore pair, which took turns in going in for maintenance. Brymon also expanded into Manchester during the year, operating routes to Aberdeen, Glasgow and Edinburgh, having taken them over from its parent, British Airways. Brymon also revealed during the year that they were considering introducing jet aircraft into the fleet. They had of course had a small fleet of 5 BAC 111s during their brief Brymon European days, but were now considering their options. The airline was considering the Canadair Regional Jet, or CRJ. The airline said that it had taken options with Bombardier on 2 70-seat Dash-8 Q400 high-speed turboprops for delivery in late 2000 and 2 similarly sized Canadair Regional Jet Series 700s for delivery in 2002. The Canadair Regional Jet wouldn't see service with Brymon, however, as the airline instead placed an order for 7 Embraer ERJ-145 regional jets with options on a further 14. Deliveries were scheduled to begin in the spring of 2000, with 5 ERJ-145s being delivered during the year on operating leases, followed by the final 2 firm orders in early 2001. Interestingly, former spouse Birmingham European, now Maersk Air UK, opted for the Canadair Regional Jet and had around 16 of them, giving folks a chance to compare as to which looks best in the BA World Tales livery. In 1999, British Airways acquired City Flyer Express, a regional airline which had been based at Gatwick Airport. City Flyer had begun life in 1991 as Euro World Express, itself formed out of the ashes of Air Europe Express. They were one of BA's franchise partners and had a fairly big presence at Gatwick. BA didn't particularly want to buy them, but their hand was forced when City Flyer's venture capital owners decided to cash in on their investment, with BA shelling out around £75 million to prevent them being sold to a competing airline like perennial thorn in the side Virgin Atlantic. At the time, British Airways said that the acquisition wouldn't really change anything and that City Flyer would continue operating as normal. 1999 would see further growth at Brymon's most northerly base, Aberdeen, with the introduction of daily flights to Oslo. The new millennium saw Brymon relocate its headquarters from Plymouth to World near Weston-super-Mare. This new headquarters, which included new training facilities, was much closer to Bristol Airport, and unsurprisingly, Brymon announced that their aircraft maintenance facilities in Plymouth were closing in favour of expanding those at Bristol. Brymon's parent company, the Plimsoll line, also announced that it had sold its operating lease of Plymouth City Airport to the Plymouth-based Sutton Harbour Holdings for a reported £2.6 million. Brymon announced that they were not planning on ceasing service to the airport and assured the public that they will be operating to Plymouth for at least the next 3 years. Both Brymon and the Plimsoll line had been in discussions with Plymouth Council for a number of years regarding extending the runway in order to facilitate larger aircraft, including the new stretch Dash-8 Q400. The council had not been particularly cooperative, and the result of this was that TPO decided to up sticks and focus even more on Bristol, who were more than accommodating and were also opening a new terminal in the spring of 2000. The North Sea oil and gas contract that Brymon had held since 1993 finally expired during the year. The contract had been extended by a year, however, from April 2000 would be in the hands of British World Airlines, formerly known as British Air Ferries. As a result of the end of these services, the two Dash-7s were withdrawn and sold off. One of these, Yankee Alpha, had been with Brymon since 1981. The first of the Embraer regional jets arrived in February. ERJA was delivered in the newly revised British Airways livery following the abandonment of the World Tails designs after less than 2 years. A second Embraer was delivered the following month, with a third arriving the month after that. Brymon were keen to show off their new jet fleet, and their fourth aircraft, Juliet Delta, delivered only days earlier, was sent to the world-famous Farnborough Airshow, where it was displayed as a ground exhibit, allowing folks to step on board and have a look around the cabin. Brymon's first two jets won't be used by the airline right away, and instead would be leased to BA franchise partner, British Regional Airlines, who would use them out of Birmingham as BA gradually began to step away from long-time partner Maersk. Following the arrival of their third ERJ, jet services began from Bristol, with Brymon using their new toy on routes to Edinburgh and Paris. 2 more Embraers would arrive during the year, bringing the Brymon fleet to 17 Dash-8s and 5 Embraers, with 2 further ERJs leased to British Regional. On the 9th of May 2001, the Plimsoll line acquired the British Regional Airlines Group for £78 million. BRA consisted of Manx Airlines of the Isle of Man and British Regional Airlines, itself formerly known as Manx Airlines Europe, and originally established to operate from the mainland UK. The story of Manx is best saved for another day, however, as this episode is already far too long. A couple of months later, on the 17th of August, the Plimsoll line changed its name to British Airways City Express Limited, and that certainly put the writing on the wall for Brymon. Interestingly, Brymon, which had been consistently earning a profit following its demerger with Birmingham European, was forced into a loss according to their accounts ending in March 2001. The airline had made a profit of £4.198 million, down from £9.504 million the previous fiscal year. However, a dividend of £17.9 million was paid out to BA, and thus the airline was left with a retained loss of £13.73 million. The following year the inevitable happened, albeit in a roundabout way. Brymon Airways was transferred from the former Plimsoll line ownership to that of the British Regional Airlines Group on the 1st of March 2002. Shortly after this, on March 28th, Brymon Airways officially changed name to British Airways City Express, and on the 1st of April 2002, British Regional Airlines was absorbed into British Airways City Express, and that is where this story ends. Okay. There's no analysis, but what happened next? Well, it didn't go wrong for Brymon. They were very successful as a regional airline, which following its parent company's acquisition of another airline group, merged the lot to form one super-regional carrier. Brymon did make a huge loss in its final 2 years, first because of BA cashing in on a huge dividend, and then the costs associated with the merger. Brymon did struggle in its early days, with the company making reasonably small losses consistently until they got too much, and then de Havilland had to step in. Brymon did a lot of good. Plymouth Airport grew alongside the airline thanks to their common ownership. Following their rebranding to British Airways City Express, the airline did reduce services at Plymouth and eventually pulled out, 3 years after the Plimsoll line sold it. Interestingly, in a reversal of roles, Sutton Harbour Holdings, who now ran Plymouth Airport, established a new airline to fill in the void left by the former Brymon. So it went from an airline owning an airport to an airport owning an airline. That new airline was Air South West, an airline which, aside from filling in the void, also operated a number of ex-Brymon aircraft. They would eventually get absorbed into another airline and leave Plymouth too, with the airport shutting down in the aftermath. I covered Air South West way back in episode 12, so go and check that out for the full story. Brymon's biggest legacy will of course be London City Airport, which almost certainly wouldn't have been built if it wasn't for Captain Harry Gee landing that Dash-7 on Heron Quay. I mentioned a number of airlines during this episode. Some I've covered like London City Airways and Air South West, and I've linked to those below. Others, such as Manx, are in the works and will be followed in due course. I do intend on covering what happened to BA City Express as it rebranded once again, this time to BA Connect, and then its ill-fated sale to Flybe. As I've said so many times before, it's amazing how some airlines are all connected. It's just too much to cover in one episode. Thanks for watching. If you have any comments, suggestions or criticisms, please do get in touch. If you don't have a YouTube doodah, don't worry, I've got a contact form on my website and I'm also on Facebook and Twitter. I have plenty more episodes in the works, so if you haven't already, why not subscribe to catch them as they land? I hope you join me next time as we mark the 50th episode of Grounded, and as always, thanks for watching.